The sea is almost black, no moon, no horizon, only the slow, nervous shimmer of reflected starlight breaking across the Pacific. It is just after midnight, engines idle low, barely breathing. A 50-foot wooden hull skims the surface, riding the water rather than cutting it. Every vibration feels loud, every second feels exposed. Ahead, Japanese ships move in disciplined silence, steel silhouettes, larger than buildings, armed with guns meant for real warships, not something this small. Their crews trust distance, armor, doctrine. They do not expect what is coming. The run required getting closer than any regulation allowed, closer than training manuals approved, closer than senior officers believed survivable. 50 feet was never meant to cross open water under fire. It was never meant to charge destroyers. The Navy had said so, officially, repeatedly, but tonight the rules are already behind them. Hands tighten on throttles. Torpedoes sit primed at point-blank range. The distance collapses faster than thought. What happens next will take 15 minutes, and by the time the water settles again, 8 Japanese ships will be burning. The question is not how it worked, but why was it forbidden in the first place? By the middle of 1942, the Pacific War had settled into an uneven rhythm. The Japanese Empire had struck fast and wide. Pearl Harbor, the Philippines, Singapore, the Dutch East Indies. Across thousands of miles of ocean, Japanese naval power moved with confidence born from preparation and early victory. Their surface fleets were intact, their crews were experienced, their doctrine emphasized night fighting, coordination, and aggressive destroyer action. For the Allies, especially the United States Navy, the situation was far less certain. Battleships lay on the bottom at Pearl Harbor. Carrier doctrine was still evolving under fire. In the vast spaces between islands, Japanese convoys moved troops, fuel, and supplies almost at will, reinforcing garrisons and extending defensive perimeters faster than Allied planners could disrupt them. Large fleet engagements would eventually rebalance the war, but in 1942, those battles were still forming in the future. What existed in the present was a problem of access. Japanese ships rarely lingered near Allied airfields. They sailed at night. They hugged coastlines. They threaded narrow channels between islands where aircraft had limited reach and submarines struggled with shallow water. Convoys were protected by destroyers, trained for close combat vessels faster, better coordinated, and more heavily armed than anything the Allies could spare for constant patrol. The U.S. Navy, built around decisive fleet actions, found itself facing a war of attrition it had not fully planned for. Destroyers were too valuable to risk in confined waters. Cruisers required air cover that was often unavailable. Submarines, still plagued by faulty torpedoes in 1942, could not be relied upon for consistent results. That left a gap, one that Japanese logistics exploited daily. Supplies moved forward. Reinforcements arrived. Island bases hardened. Every successful convoy strengthened Japan's defensive belt across the Pacific. Within Allied command rooms, the same question kept resurfacing. How do you strike an enemy who controls the night, the coastline, and the timetable? The answer, at least on paper, was not small boats. Naval tradition had little patience for craft that measured their survivability in seconds rather than armor thickness. Small attack boats were associated with coastal defense, harbor patrol, or experimental roles, not offensive operations. Against destroyer screens and merchant shipping, close-range torpedo attacks had been attempted before. In other wars, by other navies, the results were mixed. Losses were often heavy. Success depended on surprise, coordination, and nerve elements difficult to guarantee under combat conditions. For a navy rebuilding its confidence after Pearl Harbor, high risk was not an attractive doctrine. Official planning emphasized air power and submarines. Small craft were tolerated, not trusted. And yet, reality at sea kept intruding. Japanese convoys continued to run. Air raids missed targets hidden by weather or darkness. Submarines reported contact after contact without confirmed SINKINGS. Thought the war was moving faster than established. Doctrine could adapt. Along the island chains of the South Pacific, places like Solomon Islands and New Guinea, narrow waters became highways for Japanese supply ships. These were not symbolic routes. They were lifelines. Fuel, ammunition, food, troops, everything that kept forward. Bases alive moved through these channels. Disrupting them did not require sinking battleships. It required hitting transport ships, often light but heavily guarded. The problem was proximity to launch a torpedo. With any chance of success in confined waters meant closing to distances that negated every traditional advantage of a warship. It meant running directly into overlapping fields of fire. It meant trusting speed instead of steel. On paper, the math was unforgiving. A small craft charging a destroyer should not survive long enough to fire. That assumption became policy. Attack runs under a certain distance were officially discouraged, then effectively banned. The risks were deemed disproportionate to the potential gains, but bans written in officers do not always survive contact with necessity. In forward areas, officers watched convoys pass beyond reach, night after night. They watched enemy supply lines operate with near impunity, and among a small group of planners and boat crews, a different calculation began to form. Not about safety, but about opportunity. That calculation would soon collide with naval orthodoxy and force a decision between regulation and results. The boats themselves were never meant to be decisive. Weapons, they were small, lightly built, made mostly of wood, not steel. The US Navy called them patrol torpedo boats, PT boats, a designation that sounded more administrative than lethal. Their lengths varied, but most measured between 70 and 80 feet. Some experimental variants were shorter. All shared the same core philosophy: speed over protection. 3 gasoline engines, thin hull planking, no armor to speak of. At full throttle, they could outrun almost anything afloat. At any other speed, they were painfully vulnerable. Their armament looked impressive on paper: torpedoes, machine guns, sometimes light cannon, but every weapon came with a compromise. Torpedoes were unreliable in the early war. Guns required exposure. Ammunition storage was limited. Most importantly, they were visible. At night, even a small wake could give them away. A single searchlight beam could turn a fast boat into a floating target. Within naval command circles, PT boats were seen as harassment tools, useful for patrol, reconnaissance, and occasional ambushes against unescorted targets. They were not meant to challenge organized convoys protected by destroyers. Doctrine reflected this. SCEPTICISM. Engagement distances were carefully prescribed. Attack profiles emphasized standoff launches. Crews were instructed to fire torpedoes from ranges that balanced survivability against accuracy. Distances that, in practice, often proved too long for consistent hits. The closer a PT boat got, the more likely its torpedoes would strike true, but the closer it got, the less time it had to live. Early exercises reinforced command fears. Simulated attacks that pushed inside conservative limits often ended with boats destroyed on paper. The conclusions were predictable. Close-range runs were reckless. Speed alone was not protection. Losses would be unacceptable. By 1942, these conclusions hardened into restrictions, unwritten at first, then explicit. Certain attack distances were strongly discouraged. Some commands treated them as outright prohibitions. Boats were not to charge directly into escorted formations. They were not to close inside the effective range of destroyer guns. The phrase that began circulating quietly, unofficially, was suicide run. It was not a dramatic label. It was an administrative warning, and yet, combat conditions kept eroding the assumptions behind it. In the island chains of the South Pacific, PT boat squadrons found themselves operating in waters uniquely suited to their strengths: narrow straits, shallow channels, and coastlines cluttered with reefs and islands. Japanese convoys often slowed to navigate these passages. Destroyers could not maneuver freely. Large guns struggled to track small, fast-moving targets at close range, especially at night. What looked suicidal on a range chart looked different in darkness and confined water. Crews began to notice patterns. Japanese ships trusted distance and formation. Searchlights were used sparingly to avoid air attack. Escort screens focused outward, not inward. At close range, the noise of engines and surf masked approach. At very close range, torpedoes had little time to malfunction. They either ran true, or they hit almost immediately. The margin between success and destruction was measured in seconds. Some squadron commanders began to push against restrictions, testing limits under operational pressure. They shortened approach distances. They altered attack angles. They trusted speed and surprise over doctrine. Each successful hit added weight to their argument. Each boat that returned intact undermined the ban. Still, higher command remained cautious. Losses elsewhere in the Pacific were already severe. The Navy could not afford experimental bravado. For every successful night attack, there were missions that ended with damaged boats, wounded crews, or near misses that could easily have become disasters. The debate became philosophical as much as tactical. Was it better to preserve limited assets, or to accept extreme risk in order to achieve results that no other force could deliver? That question crystallized around one specific operation, in one specific stretch of water, where Japanese shipping had grown bold and predictable, a place where convoys ran on schedule, where escorts followed routine, where a 50-foot approach would either prove madness or change naval thinking overnight. The boats were ready, the crews were trained, and one commander was willing to ignore what the manuals said would happen next. That decision would carry them straight into the most dangerous 15 minutes of their war. For the men aboard the boats, doctrine was something read in classrooms. Fear was something felt in the chest. Most PT boat crews were young, early 20s, often younger. Many had never served at sea before the war. Their boats offered no protection from shellfire, nor mud compartments, no margin for error. At night, the ocean erased distance. A destroyer could feel both impossibly far and dangerously close at the same time. Every shadow hinted at gun barrels. Every wave slap sounded like detection. These crews understood the odds instinctively. They knew that if a searchlight caught them inside a few hundred yards, escape would be unlikely. They also knew that turning away too early meant torpedoes running wide, missions failing, and convoys continuing untouched. The choice was never abstract. Throttle forward or throttle back. Commit or retreat. No one spoke of heroics. They spoke of timing, angles, and seconds. Survival depended on calm hands and the willingness to continue even when instinct screamed to break. Away. The band run was simple in description and brutal in execution. Instead of launching torpedoes from long range, the boat would close directly toward the target, reducing the chance of torpedo failure and minimizing enemy reaction time. The approach relied on darkness, speed, and confusion. At 50 feet, a torpedo barely had time to stabilize before impact. The enemy had even less time to respond. The risk was exposure. Destroyer guns, even secondary weapons, could shred a wooden hull instantly. One accurate burst would end the run, but the confined waters changed the equation. Japanese ships could not easily turn. Their formations compressed. Firing arcs overlapped, poorly against targets moving faster than expected, and closer than planned for. The tactic traded safety for certainty. One hit mattered more than survival. Probabilities on paper. The boats were pushed beyond what their designers envisioned. Gasoline engines screamed at maximum output. Hulls flexed under speed. Vibrations threatened to shake loose equipment. There was no redundancy. A single mechanical failure could leave a boat drifting inside enemy guns. Torpedoes were modified, adjusted, sometimes physically handled by crews who knew their quirks better than any engineer. Crews learned which angles minimized duds, which speeds stabilized runs, which conditions favored reliability. Nothing about the technology promised forgiveness. It demanded precision and nerve. Every element converged toward one conclusion. The run would either work immediately or fail catastrophically. That reality shaped every decision as the boats lined up for their approach. And beyond the crews and the machines stood another factor: command, weighing responsibility against opportunity, watching a forbidden tactic move closer to execution. For the officers who authorized the mission, the risk was personal. PT boat commanders operated far from the centers of power, but they were still bound by regulations written by men who would never stand on a wooden deck under to approve a close-range run meant accepting responsibility not just for success, but for potential annihilation. If the boats were lost, the report would be simple: disobedience, recklessness, avoidable casualties. Yet command in war is not only about adherence, it is about judgment. These officers had watched standard tactics fail repeatedly. They had watched Japanese convoys pass through narrow waters untouched. They understood that waiting for perfect conditions was another way of surrendering. Initiative, authorizing the run, meant trusting junior officers and enlisted crews with an impossible task, and accepting that success would validate the decision. Only after the fact. There would be no second chances. From the Japanese perspective, The threat profile looked different. Imperial Japanese Navy doctrine emphasized decisive engagements and destroyer-led night actions against comparable enemy forces. Small craft were not ignored, but they were not prioritized as convoy killers. Convoys relied on spacing, formation, discipline, and the assumption that torpedoes would come from predictable distances. Defensive fire plans were built around expected engagement envelopes. At extreme close range, those assumptions collapsed. Searchlights became liabilities. Heavy guns could not depress fast enough. Secondary weapons struggled with tracking speed and angle in darkness. Most critically, the psychological expectation of safety inside escort screens dulled reaction time. A threat that should not exist was slower to be recognized. In those seconds of disbelief, distance vanished. The accusation of suicide run carried moral weight. Was it acceptable to ask men to take risks that planners deemed excessive? Or was it immoral to deny them the chance to strike when they believed success was possible? The crews did not see themselves as expendable. They saw themselves as specialists operating in a space no one else could reach. Their willingness was not coerced. It was deliberate. They understood the danger. They accepted it anyway. The moral tension lay not in recklessness, but in necessity. Every convoy that passed unchallenged prolonged the war. Every successful attack saved lives elsewhere, on beaches, in jungles, in skies far beyond the narrow channel they were about to enter. As the boats closed in, doctrine, leadership, technology, and human resolve converged into a single point of no return. The enemy silhouettes grew larger, the water between them vanished, and the first torpedo run, the one that was never supposed to happen, was seconds away. Engines roared to full power, their sound briefly tearing through the silence before dissolving into wind and spray. At this speed, there is no room for hesitation, no room to reassess. The approach angle is locked. The distance is collapsing too fast to measure twice. The Japanese convoy emerges from darkness in fragments, first a mast, then a superstructure, then the unmistakable mass of a transport ship riding low in the water. Escorting destroyers slide along its flanks, steady, methodical, confident. No alarms yet. The PT boats split, fanning out just enough to avoid collision, not enough to dilute concentration. Each crew is focused on a single target. No one is watching the wider battle. There is no wider battle yet. At less than 300 yards, the danger becomes physical. The ship's hull seems to rise out of the sea. Gun barrels are visible now. Shapes resolve into edges. Still no searchlights. The lead boat closes inside. 100 yards. This is the distance the manuals warned against. This is where probability disappears. The torpedo officer signals. Tubes snap open. Compressed air hisses, sharp and unmistakable. One torpedo drops, then another. They run true. Seconds later, the convoy reacts too late. Searchlights snap on, slicing across the water where the boats were moments ago. Machine guns opened fire, stitching white water behind fleeing wakes. The first explosion hits amidships. It is not cinematic. It is violent and abrupt. A column of fire punches upward, followed by smoke and debris. The transport begins to list almost immediately, its momentum carrying it forward even as the hull floods. The second torpedo strikes another vessel in the formation. The blast reverberates through the channel, echoing off unseen shorelines. Confusion spreads faster than orders. Destroyers turn hard, their formations breaking as they attempt to identify targets that are already gone. Firing arcs overlap uselessly. Shells tear through empty water. The PT boats are already repositioning. They do not pause to observe damage. There is no time for confirmation. Each crew knows the pattern now. Close, fire, disappear. Another run begins. Closer than the first, a different boat charges straight toward an escorting ship, its silhouette shrinking against the destroyer's bulk. Tracers arc overhead. Splinters fly as near misses punch holes through the thin hull. At the last possible moment, the boat slews sideways. A torpedo drops at almost point-blank range. Impact follows almost instantly. The destroyer shudders, its bow lifting unnaturally as fire erupts along the waterline. It does not sink immediately. It does not need to. The channel is now in chaos. Burning ships illuminate the night. Orders overlap. Guns fire without clear targets. Japanese crews fight fires and flooding while trying to re-establish control. And in the confusion, the boats circle back. What was once a forbidden tactic has become a rhythm. The first minutes have already rewritten the odds, and the most devastating part of the attack is still unfolding. The next 15 minutes erase every assumption the convoy was built upon. Japanese officers struggle to regain order, but the battle no longer follows recognizable form. Ships meant to move as a unit are now isolated, turning independently, masking one another's fire. Signals are shouted, then lost in smoke and flame. The PT boats exploit the fracture immediately. They strike from multiple directions, never lingering, never repeating the same angle twice. Each approach is shorter than the last, 50 feet, sometimes less. The boats appear out of darkness, fire, and vanish before gun crews can adjust. A third transport takes a torpedo below the waterline. Its lights flicker once, then go out entirely. Men spill onto decks illuminated by firelight as the ship begins to settle. Lifeboats are lowered under incoming fire meant for attackers. Already gone. Another explosion follows, then another. The convoy is no longer moving forward. It is stopped, burning, colliding with itself in confined water. One ship drift into another, spreading fire across decks, slick with fuel. Destroyers attempt to pursue, but speed is useless without targets. The PT boats are faster in the turns, faster in acceleration, and invisible beyond the edge of flamelit water. Each time a searchlight locks onto a wake, the boat attached to it is already somewhere else. The psychological effect is immediate. Japanese gunners fire at shadows. Officers hesitate, unsure whether to hold formation or scatter. Every splash like an incoming torpedo. Every engine noise triggers defensive fire. The PT crews feel it too. The moment when fear gives way to momentum, they are no longer attacking a convoy. They are hunting for confusion. A fourth ship erupts in flame, then a fifth. Some torpedoes miss, some malfunction, but enough strike true that the pattern becomes undeniable. The tactic works not because it is safe, but because it overwhelms decision-making. At close range, armor means nothing. At close range, reaction time is everything. Within the space of a quarter hour, 8 Japanese ships are hit, some catastrophically, others damaged badly enough to be rendered useless. Fires rage uncontrollably. Flooding spreads. Radios crackle with fragmentary reports that do not match the reality unfolding on the water. And still, the PT boats survive. One takes damage, other limps briefly before engines recover. None are lost in the channel. When the last torpedo is fired, there is no formal signal to disengage. The boats simply fade back into darkness, slipping away along the same narrow paths that brought them in. Behind them, the water glows orange. Smoke drifts low. The convoy, once orderly, protected, confident, is broken. By dawn, Japanese crews will begin counting ships. By morning reports, naval officers will count explanations. But in the moment, there is only silence returning to the channel, broken by distant fires and the slow settling of steel into water. A tactic once dismissed as suicidal has just destroyed 8 enemy ships in 15 minutes. And now, the reckoning begins. Dawn arrives slowly over the channel. Smoke still hangs low above the water, drifting in uneven layers that blur the shoreline. Fires burn where ships once moved in formation. Wreckage floats outward with the tide. Splintered wood, twisted metal, oil spreading in dark sheets across the surface. Japanese crews begin the count. Some ships are gone entirely, sunk during the night or settling beneath the waterline as the light grows. Others remain afloat but crippled, engines disabled, hulls breached, superstructures burned hollow. What had been a functioning convoy is now a collection of casualties. Reports move up the chain of command. Cautious at first, then increasingly urgent. 8 ships hit, multiple losses confirmed. The exact number of sinkings will take days to verify, but the disruption is undeniable. For Japanese planners, the shock is not only material. The attack violates expectations. There is no record of cruiser action, no submarine contact, no air raid. The damage has come from a force considered marginal, boats too small, too fragile, too exposed to operate this aggressively. The question emerges almost immediately: how did they get so close? On the Allied side, the boats return individually, quietly. There is no victory parade, no immediate announcement. Crews secure lines, shut down engines, and begin the mechanical ritual of inspection, checking holes for holes, engines for stress fractures, weapons for damage. Only then does the weight of survival settle in. Some boats bear scars, splintered planking, shattered fittings, bullet holes that missed fuel tanks by inches. Others look almost untouched, an illusion created by darkness and chance. Casualty reports are compiled. Compared to expectations, they are astonishingly light. The Forbidden Run has not produced the massacre its critics predicted. Intelligence officers begin piecing together the night's events from fragmented observations, torpedo tracks, explosion timings, survivor accounts. The pattern becomes clear. Close-range attacks overwhelmed defensive response. Speed and surprise compensated for lack of armor. Doctrine failed to account for human hesitation under unexpected threat. Within hours, word reaches higher command. The reaction is restrained, professional, but unmistakable. Questions are asked, not about disobedience, but about replication. Could this be done again? Under what conditions? With what limits? The tone has shifted. What was once prohibited is now under review. The aftermath does not end. With damaged ships and smoldering wreckage, it extends into planning rooms, briefing papers, and operational directives that will quietly reshape how small craft are used in the Pacific. But before policy can change, consequences must be measured and lessons extracted from a night that challenged everything naval. Orthodoxy assumed about scale, safety, and survivability. Those lessons are about to travel far beyond the narrow channel where they were learned. In the days that follow, the attack is dissected with methodical precision. Operational reports move through naval headquarters, stripped of emotion, reduced to timings, distances, and outcomes. Every torpedo launch is logged. Every maneuver is reconstructed. The emphasis is not on bravery, but on mechanics. What worked, and why. The conclusions are uncomfortable for traditionalists. The convoy had not been poorly protected. The escorts had not been negligent. The ships had not been obsolete. The failure lay in assumption. Japanese planners had assumed that threats would conform to known envelopes, that attack distances would remain predictable, that small craft would behave cautiously in the face of overwhelming firepower. They had not accounted for attackers willing to accept extreme proximity as an advantage rather than a liability. For the U.S. Navy, the implications are immediate. Restrictions surrounding PT boat attack distances are quietly revised. Language softens. What was once discouraged becomes command-dependent. What was once labeled suicidal becomes situationally appropriate. No public announcement marks the change. There is no doctrinal manifesto. Instead, the shift appears in the margins, in after-action reviews, in revised training guidance, in the tone officers use when discussing risk. PT, boat squadrons begin to receive different missions. More night operations, more independent action, more authority delegated to junior commanders on scene. The boats themselves are modified incrementally. Additional weapons are added. Crews experiment with tactics that exploit confusion rather than brute force. Speed and aggression become assets to be refined, not dangers to be avoided. Japanese convoy behavior also changes. Routes are altered. Escorts increase. Schedules become less predictable. Resources are diverted to protect supply lines that were once considered secure. Every destroyer assigned to escort duty is a destroyer, not available elsewhere. The impact ripples outward. Island garrisons feel shortages sooner. Construction slows. Reinforcements arrive later, if at all. The cumulative effect is subtle but persistent. Pressure applied not through grand battles, but through repeated disruption. The men who executed the run return to routine operations. There are no grand speeches, no immediate decorations. Their achievement enters the war quietly, embedded in statistics and alter-read behaviors, rather than headlines. Some will repeat similar missions. Some will not survive later ones. All carry forward the knowledge that doctrine can be rewritten under fire. The suicide run does not become standard practice. It remains situational, conditional, dependent on darkness, geography, and nerve. But it is no longer unthinkable, and in that shift from forbidden to possible, the war's character subtly changes. Small units gain relevance, initiative regains value, and innovation proves capable of surviving bureaucracy. When results are undeniable, the wreckage in the channel will eventually be cleared or forgotten. But the lesson it left behind endures, waiting for reflection. Battleships, carrier decks, armies moving across continents. But history also turns on smaller silhouettes moments. When scale is irrelevant and proximity decides, everything. The 50-foot run did not win the Pacific War. It did not end convoys or collapse empires overnight. What it did was expose a flaw that only courage and calculation could reveal. That certainty in war is often built on assumptions that have never been tested under pressure. The men who drove wooden boats into steel formations were not chasing glory. They were solving a problem no one else could reach. Their success was not inevitable. It was conditional on darkness, on geography, on discipline held together by seconds and trust. The tactic was never safe. It was never clean. It was simply effective when nothing else was in that narrow channel. Doctrine gave way to reality. The idea that survival required distance was replaced by the understanding that sometimes survival depends on closeness, on forcing the enemy to react before they can think. The lesson traveled forward through the war and beyond it. Modern navies still debate the balance between protection and agility, between centralized control and initiative at the edge, between what regulations permit and what circumstances demand. The burned holes left behind that night eventually disappeared beneath tide and time. The men moved on, some to other battles, some back into civilian life, carrying memories few would ever ask them to describe. But the idea endured, that even in industrial war, small forces could still matter, that innovation could survive prohibition, and that sometimes the difference between recklessness and brilliance is 15 minutes, measured not in theory, but in results. The ocean closed over the wreckage, the doctrine changed, and history quietly adjusted its course.